The silence of my home in Riverside, Pennsylvania was not an emptiness but a canvas. It was the backdrop against which I painted my meticulous observations, my intricate webs of data, and the quiet, almost imperceptible threads of what I considered true justice. My name is Celeste Morrow, and I am 48 years old. Most people, if they noticed me at all, might describe me as unassuming, perhaps even a little reclusive. They would see the quiet woman who always paid her bills on time, who kept her small garden meticulously neat, and who never seemed to stir up any trouble. They would be entirely wrong, of course. My dispassion was my strength, honed over years, forged in the bitter crucible of a profound betrayal. It was more than a decade ago now, but the memory remained as sharp as a newly filed blade. I owned a small antique restoration business, then Timeless Treasures, nestled right in the heart of our quaint downtown. It wasn't just a shop, it was my life's work, a place where history whispered from every restored piece, where I poured my soul into mending what time had broken. Business was good, my reputation solid, and I felt a sense of belonging in this town that ran deep, like the roots of the old oak trees lining Main Street. Then came Mayor Harrison. He was a man of grand pronouncements and small, grasping hands. He wanted to modernize our downtown, and my building, a sturdy, historic structure, stood directly in the path of his vision, or rather, in the path of a lucrative deal with a developer who happened to be a significant campaign donor. Suddenly, my zoning permits were questioned, building codes I'd met for years became violations, and a seemingly endless stream of obscure regulations descended upon me like locusts. I fought, of course. I hired lawyers, attended endless meetings, presented stacks of documents proving my compliance. But it was a rigged game. Harrison's office, with its bureaucratic machinery, simply overwhelmed me. Each appeal was denied, each piece of evidence dismissed with a shrug or a condescending smile. Eventually, broken and financially drained, I had no choice but to sell my beloved, timeless treasures for a pittance to the very developer Harrison championed. The building was razed, replaced by a soulless, modern office block that remains half empty to this day. That betrayal, that cold, calculated act of governmental power crushing a solitary citizen, was the genesis of my true calling. I learned then that individual pleas for justice often fall on deaf ears. Isolated incidents are easily dismissed as unfortunate anomalies, but patterns are harder to ignore, and so I began to document, systematically, methodically. Every instance of bureaucratic overreach, every petty abuse of authority, every whisper of impropriety I encountered or heard about in Riverside found its way into my ever-expanding archives. I built a system that would make any intelligence agency proud. Digital files cross-referenced with physical binders, newspaper clippings alongside scanned public records, even transcribed conversations and anonymous tips. I sought not just the facts, but the connections, the subtle threads that linked seemingly disparate events into a cohesive, damning narrative. My motivation was no longer personal vengeance against Harrison, who had long since faded into a comfortable retirement. No, my motivation had broadened, deepened. It was about true justice, about revealing the insidious patterns of corruption that undermine communities one petty act at a time. It was about prevention, about ensuring that what happened to timeless treasures would not happen to another cherished local establishment. And that brings me to Councilman Wallace Thorne. He was the rising star of Riverside politics, a man in his early 40s with a charming smile, an expensive suit, and a slick, persuasive manner. He swept into town 2 years ago, promising progress and prosperity, riding a wave of populist sentiment. He spoke passionately about supporting local businesses, about revitalizing neglected areas, about fostering community spirit. It was all very convincing, especially if you hadn't been paying attention, not truly paying attention to the quiet hum of dissent beneath the surface. I, however, had been paying attention. Every one of his public statements, every vote he cast, every development proposal he championed was meticulously entered into my system. I was an observer, a listener, a compiler of facts. I preferred to remain in the background, a silent sentinel, but my presence was felt in the eventual outcomes, in the carefully curated information that found its way into the right hands. Thorne's pet project was the Riverside Renaissance Initiative, a grand plan to redevelop the old industrial district near the river. On paper, it sounded wonderful: new apartments, trendy shops, a bustling waterfront promenade. But beneath the glossy brochures, I saw the familiar, ugly pattern emerging. Key parcels of land, previously owned by long-standing, modest businesses or community groups, were being targeted for eminent domain or predatory buyouts. And the primary beneficiary of these redevelopments? Thorne's former employer, a large, out-of-state real estate development firm, Thorne Corp. The connections were subtle at first, veiled by layers of shell companies and proxy agreements, but my system, my meticulous records, began to paint a clear, damning picture. The current target of Thorne's avarice was a place known as the Riverside Hub. It wasn't just a building, it was the beating heart of our community. Housed in a repurposed old factory, the hub was a vibrant collection of small, independent businesses, art studios, and a free community center that offered everything from coding classes for kids to financial literacy workshops for adults. It was run by a dedicated collective of volunteers and local entrepreneurs, most of whom had poured their life savings into making it a success. The hub was exactly the kind of place Thorne claimed he wanted to support, yet he was systematically undermining it, pushing for its demolition to make way for a luxury condominium complex that would coincidentally be built by Thorne Corp. The hypocrisy was blatant, but the average citizen caught up in the daily grind simply didn't see the full tapestry of deceit. That was where I came in. I began my deep dive into Thorne, focusing specifically on his machinations against the hub. My mornings started early with a strong cup of tea and a digital scan of every local news outlet, every social media group, every public record released by the city. My office was a small, unassuming room at the back of my house, filled with filing cabinets, a high-resolution scanner, and a computer with multiple monitors displaying intricate spreadsheets and cross-reference documents. It looked like a well-organized accounting firm, but every single file, every line of data told a story of power, corruption, and the slow, insidious erosion of community trust. I attended every town hall meeting, every public forum where Thorne spoke. I didn't ask questions, I just listened, my gaze unwavering, my notebook in hand. I recorded his words, compared them to his previous statements, and cross-referenced them with the public records of his votes and proposals. The inconsistencies were always there, subtle at first, then growing more pronounced as his confidence swelled. He would stand there, radiating charm, promising progress while simultaneously eroding the foundations of the very community he claimed to serve. He spoke in broad, optimistic strokes, while the details, the truly damning details, were buried deep in appendices and footnotes of obscure zoning amendments. One afternoon, I sat in the back row of a particularly heated community meeting concerning the hub. The room buzzed with a mixture of anger and desperation. Thorne, poised and unflappable, delivered a rehearsed speech about the inevitable march of progress and the tough but necessary choices for Riverside's future. He spoke of blight and underutilization, painting the hub as a crumbling relic rather than a thriving hub of activity. My fingers flew across my tablet, transcribing his words, noting his specific phrases, ready to cross-reference them with the architectural reports and financial statements I had already acquired. It was a precise, almost clinical process, devoid of emotion, yet driven by an unwavering conviction that the truth, meticulously documented, would always eventually find its mark. As I compiled the data, I felt a familiar surge, not of anger but of cold, clear purpose. The patterns were undeniable: the inflated appraisals of hub properties, the expedited demolition permits, the sudden appearance of a small, obscure amendment to a city ordinance that seemed tailor-made to disenfranchise the hub's collective ownership structure. Thorne was moving fast, confident that no one would be able to untangle his web of legal maneuvers and political pressure before it was too late. He underestimated the power of quiet observation and the relentless pursuit of facts. He underestimated me. This process, this silent, methodical accumulation of truth, was my way of fighting back. It was a long game played with patience and precision, and I knew from experience that when the time was right, my carefully gathered information would serve as the spark. It would ignite the outrage of those who had been wronged, empower those who felt powerless, and ultimately expose the architects of injustice for all to see. To witness these intricate narratives of betrayal and eventual vindication, I recommend you subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. I knew that Thorne, like Harrison before him, believed himself untouchable. But the truth, when presented with irrefutable clarity, had a way of cutting through even the thickest armor of lies and political influence. My files were growing, page by page, gigabyte by gigabyte, becoming an arsenal of undeniable facts, waiting for the precise moment to be deployed. The struggle, as it always did, began subtly. Thorne's campaign against the Riverside hub escalated from veiled threats to overt pressure. City inspectors, suddenly hypervigilant, began finding a litany of minor, often spurious violations at the old factory building. Fire code infractions that had never been an issue, archaic zoning nuances resurrected from decades-old bylaws, even complaints about parking that materialized out of thin air. Each new notice, each new fine, each new bureaucratic hurdle was designed to bleed the hub's collective dry, to break their spirit, and to force them into a quick lowball sale. I logged every single one, noting the dates, the specific inspectors, the exact wording of the citations. I cross-referenced the names of these inspectors with the city's employee directory, checking for any new hires or transfers that might align with Thorne's tenure. Sure enough, a few key personnel in the permitting and inspection departments had indeed been recently appointed or promoted, their previous roles often less aligned with strict regulatory enforcement. I could feel the despair growing among the hub's members. They were artists, bakers, small-time entrepreneurs, people with passion but little experience navigating the labyrinthine corridors of municipal bureaucracy. I watched them at town meetings, their faces drawn, their voices tired. They tried to fight back, holding fundraisers, organizing petitions, but they were swamped by the endless paperwork, the legal fees, the sheer exhaustion of battling an unseen, implacable enemy. I saw the familiar signs of what I had gone through years ago, the slow suffocation of a dream under the weight of corrupt authority. My dispassionate observation sometimes wavered, a flicker of that old, familiar frustration, that burning sense of injustice stirring within me, but I quickly suppressed it. Emotion clouded judgment, facts illuminated truth. My work became more intense. I was now spending upwards of 10 hours a day at my computer or quietly moving through Riverside observing. I'd park my unassuming sedan across the street from Thorne's office, noting who went in and out, the expensive cars, the hushed conversations. I'd visit the local library, poring over old microfiche records for any historical land deals or zoning changes that might offer a clue. I even subscribed to obscure real estate journals, tracking property transfers and LLC formations. My life had become a tapestry of data points, each one a thread in the intricate design of Thorne's corruption. One afternoon, a local journalist named Marcus Thorne, no relation to Wallace, published a skeptical piece in the * Riverside Chronicle about the Renaissance Initiative. Marcus was young, earnest, and deeply frustrated by the lack of transparency in local government. His article was well researched, but it lacked the smoking gun, the irrefutable evidence that would break through the public's apathy and Thorne's carefully crafted facade. I saw his struggle. He was looking for a pattern, but he didn't have the full picture, the years of documented minutiae that I possessed. He was a potential conduit, a voice that could carry my information into the public sphere. I decided it was time to make a subtle move. Not a direct approach, never a direct approach. My role was to facilitate, to arm the rightful actors with the truth, not to be the face of the battle. I sent Marcus an anonymous, untraceable email from a burner account, attaching a single, meticulously compiled spreadsheet. It detailed the ownership structure of Thorne Corp's various subsidiaries, cross-referencing them with the campaign donations made to Wallace Thorne's past and present campaigns and with the recent property acquisitions in the old industrial district. It was just enough information to pique his interest, to show him that someone else saw the connections, to guide his investigative instincts without giving away my hand. I included a single, cryptic sentence at the bottom: "The pattern reveals the intent." Marcus's follow-up article was a firestorm. He didn't outright accuse Thorne of corruption, but he laid out the facts I had provided, asking pointed questions about the interlocking financial interests between the councilman and the primary developer of the Renaissance Initiative. The article sent ripples through Riverside. Thorne, usually unflappable, issued a terse denial, calling it unsubstantiated conjecture and yellow journalism. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Thorne knew someone was digging, someone was watching, and it made him reckless. His response was to double down on the hub. The city issued an immediate stop work order on all operations at the facility, citing a fabricated structural instability issue. This was a clear attempt to completely cripple them, to make their continued resistance impossible. The hub's collective held an emergency meeting, desperate and overwhelmed. I attended, sitting in the back, observing their faces, their despair. One of the hub's founders, a kind, elderly woman named Martha who ran a small pottery studio there, spoke with tears in her eyes about how this was their life, their community, being systematically dismantled. It was heartbreaking to watch, and for a fleeting moment I allowed myself to feel the raw emotion of it all, the echo of my own past pain. This was precisely why I did what I did. To see these injustices corrected, to witness the unraveling of such deliberate harm, subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. This escalating pressure from Thorne, this overt bullying, was exactly what I needed. It pushed Thorne into overreach, creating more opportunities for him to make mistakes. It also created an urgent need for the hub to find a solution, making them more receptive to unconventional help. I knew Marcus Thorne was struggling to find his next lead, to find the irrefutable proof he needed to expose Wallace Thorne. He had the drive, the public platform, but he lacked the deep, systemic knowledge that only years of obsessive documentation could provide. My next anonymous email to Marcus was more substantial. It included scanned copies of internal city documents, procurement records, and email exchanges obtained through a discreet source within City Hall, cultivated over years, that showed how Thorne had quietly lobbied for specific zoning changes that directly benefited Thorne Corp, even before he officially joined the council. It showed a clear conflict of interest, a direct line from his personal gain to his political actions. I also included a detailed financial analysis of the projected profits for Thorne Corp from the Renaissance Initiative, juxtaposed with the estimated losses for the hub and other displaced businesses. The numbers were staggering, revealing the sheer scale of the financial motive behind his actions. The stakes were escalating rapidly. Thorne's legal team began sending cease and desist letters to the hub, threatening lawsuits, attempting to silence them with legal intimidation. They even started making subtle threats against Marcus, hinting at defamation suits and irreparable career damage. This was Thorne's standard playbook: bully, intimidate, drown dissent in legal paperwork. But he was fighting against a force he didn't even know existed. A silent, methodical accumulator of truth, armed with a database of his every misstep, every lie, every pattern of corruption. My files were no longer just a collection of data, they were a roadmap to his downfall, and the time for their full deployment was fast approaching. The struggle was reaching its climax, and the carefully orchestrated plan was about to begin its final, decisive phase. The meticulous, almost surgical precision of my work had built to this moment. Wallace Thorne, emboldened by his initial successes in stifling dissent and confident in his network of political allies, had pushed too far. His stop work order on the Riverside hub, coupled with the aggressive legal threats against them and against Marcus Thorne, had finally ignited the sleeping tiger of community outrage. But outrage without direction, without proof, was merely noise. My role was to provide the direction, to supply the irrefutable evidence that would transform that noise into a deafening roar. My final package to Marcus Thorne was delivered discreetly to his home mailbox, disguised as an ordinary piece of junk mail. Inside, tucked within a brochure for discount home improvement, was a tiny, encrypted USB drive. It contained everything: a comprehensive timeline of Wallace Thorne's public statements versus his private actions, detailed financial flows between Thorne Corp and various shell companies linked to his family members, sworn affidavits from former city employees who had quietly come forward over the years, their identities protected, of course, detailing instances of coercion and fraud under Thorne's influence. It included copies of forged permits, inflated appraisals, and a particularly damning series of emails proving Thorne had personally intervened to expedite the demolition permits for the hub, bypassing standard procedures. Each document was cross-referenced, meticulously dated, and accompanied by my own concise, dispassionate analysis highlighting the patterns of malfeasance. I had even included a detailed projection of how much Wallace Thorne stood to personally gain from the Renaissance Initiative, a figure that would shock even the most jaded observer. This was not just a collection of facts, it was a weapon forged in patience and sharpened by years of observation. The first public blow landed like a perfectly aimed strike. Marcus Thorne, emboldened by the sheer weight of evidence I had provided, published a special investigative report that spanned 3 full pages of the Riverside Chronicle asterisk. He didn't just report, he presented. He laid out the timeline, the financial connections, the irregularities in the permitting process. He cited specific documents showing scanned images of the most damning pieces of evidence, anonymized where necessary. The article didn't speculate, it merely presented the facts, allowing the reader to connect the dots. The reaction was immediate and explosive. People who had dismissed his earlier pieces as conjecture now saw irrefutable proof. The community, already simmering with resentment over the hub, erupted. Calls to the city council flooded their offices. Social media channels were ablaze with outrage. Wallace Thorne's carefully constructed image began to crack. Thorne, true to form, responded with a furious denial, calling the article a malicious smear campaign orchestrated by vested interests trying to derail Riverside's progress. He threatened Marcus and the Chronicle with immediate lawsuits for defamation, libel, and economic damages. He even convened a special press conference where he stood defiant, radiating his usual charm, attempting to spin the narrative. He relied on the old trick: attack the messenger, discredit the source. But he hadn't anticipated the second, more devastating blow. That evening, a collective of lawyers, quietly assembled by some of the hub's more financially astute members, lawyers who had received their own anonymous package of highly technical legal documents from me, filed an injunction against the city, citing an extensive list of procedural irregularities and conflicts of interest in the Renaissance Initiative. Their filing was backed by an unprecedented volume of meticulously detailed legal arguments, each point buttressed by my comprehensive data. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an unwinnable legal assault. The documents were so thorough, so interconnected, that city attorneys found themselves scrambling, unable to find a single valid counterargument. The judge, presented with such overwhelming evidence, granted the injunction, immediately halting all demolition permits and land acquisitions related to Thorne's project. The news hit Riverside like a thunderclap. The Renaissance Initiative, Thorne's pet project, was dead in the water, but the unraveling of Wallace Thorne was far from over. With the injunction in place and the public demanding answers, the district attorney's office, which had previously dismissed complaints about Thorne as lacking sufficient evidence, was now forced to act. My data, specifically the sworn affidavits from former city employees and the undeniable proof of forged documents, became the cornerstone of their investigation. I had designed my system not just to expose, but to be legally admissible. Every piece of information was collected with that ultimate goal in mind. Thorne tried to fight back, leveraging his political connections, calling in favors, trying to intimidate witnesses. He publicly denounced the DA's investigation as a political witch hunt. But my network, built over years of quiet observation and careful cultivation of sources, had anticipated his moves. I fed counterinformation to the DA's office, always anonymously, always through intermediaries. I provided the location of hidden documents, suggested specific lines of questioning, even detailed the financial transactions of his close associates, who were now feeling the heat. Thorne found himself trapped in a tightening net, with every attempt to escape only pulling the strands tighter. The climax arrived not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in a series of quiet, devastating developments. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the threat of multiple felony charges, several of Thorne's closest associates turned state's evidence, cutting deals to save themselves. The cascade of confessions and further incriminating documents sealed his fate. The financial irregularities, the abuses of power, the outright fraud, it was all laid bare. The DA's office announced an indictment against Wallace Thorne on multiple counts of public corruption, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Thorne resigned from the city council in disgrace, his carefully constructed persona shattered. He vanished from public life, his charming smile replaced by a grim, haunted expression as he faced the legal and financial ruin he had so callously inflicted upon others. The Renaissance Initiative was officially abandoned, and the Riverside Hub, now free from the relentless pressure, not only survived but thrived, becoming a symbol of community resilience and the power of collective action. I watched it all unfold from my quiet vantage point in Riverside, a silent witness to the complete meticulous dismantling of a corrupt individual. There was no grand celebration for me, no public recognition. That wasn't my purpose. My satisfaction came from the quiet vindication, the knowledge that my years of patient observation, my dispassionate accumulation of facts, had delivered a true and lasting form of justice. The system worked not because of a single hero, but because of the undeniable weight of the truth, revealed piece by painstaking piece. The town slowly began to heal. New, honest leaders emerged, and a newfound vigilance settled over the community, but I knew better than to believe the fight was truly over. Corruption, like a persistent weed, would always seek new ground, and so I continued my work. My system remained active, ever expanding, ever ready. The files continued to grow, the patterns continued to emerge. Because in Riverside, Pennsylvania, justice was not an abstract ideal, it was a meticulous, continuous process championed by a silent observer. My work, I knew, was never truly done. I remained, as always, the methodical record keeper, the quiet facilitator, ever vigilant. And if you seek further narratives of such intricate justice, remember to subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.